The morning it began, the air was still and sharp, the kind of winter morning where sound carries farther than it should. I was pouring my first cup of coffee when I heard it, a harsh mechanical roar that didn't belong to my quiet street. At first I thought maybe one of the county crews had come through early, trimming roadside brush, but when I stepped onto the porch, the sight stopped me cold. My neighbor, Frank Dillard, stood in my yard with a chainsaw in his hands. He wasn't trimming brush. He was cutting down one of my maples. The old tree swayed under his saw, wood chips flying like sparks against the snow. It had stood there for 40 years, tall and proud, its branches arching wide to shade the corner of my yard. Margaret and I had planted it together when we first bought this property, back when we were still young and full of plans. Now it lay half-severed, moaning under the assault, while Frank leaned into the cut, as if the land were his. "Frank!" I shouted, my voice rough with disbelief. "What the hell are you doing?" He shut off the saw, finally noticing me. His expression wasn't apologetic, not even surprised. He looked at me the way a man looks at someone stepping onto his lawn uninvited. "Morning, Robert," he called back, as if it were a casual greeting. "This tree's been blocking my sunlight for years. I figured I'd take care of it." "Your sunlight?" I stepped down the porch steps, boots crunching in the frost. "That's my tree, Frank, on my land. You've got no right." He shrugged, unbothered, and wiped his hands on his jacket. "Property lines are fuzzy around here. Besides, you weren't using it. It's dead weight." Dead weight. The word stung more than I cared to admit. Margaret had chosen that maple. She'd said it would grow sturdy and beautiful, the kind of tree that would outlast us both. Every summer she sat under it with her gardening book, humming as she worked the soil around her flowers. Even after she passed, I couldn't bring myself to change the bench we'd set beneath it. That tree wasn't dead weight. It was memory. It was hers. "You put that saw away," I said quietly, though my voice trembled with anger. "Or you'll regret it," he smirked. That smirk. Smug, dismissive. The kind of look that said he thought I was too old, too soft, too worn down to matter. "Relax, old man. I'm improving both our yards. You'll thank me." Then, without waiting for my answer, he fired the chainsaw again. The teeth bit deeper into the trunk, drowning out my words, drowning out the history etched into the rings of that tree. Seconds later, the maple groaned once more, then toppled with a thunderous crash across the snow. Branches split, scattering like bones, the bench beneath it crushed to splinters. I stood frozen, coffee cooling in my hand, as Frank wiped sweat from his brow like he'd just finished a noble chore. "There," he said, satisfied. "Now we've both got more light." I wanted to shout. I wanted to storm across that boundary and shove the chainsaw down into the snow. But the weight of years held me back. At 68, you learn that anger burns fast, while patience lasts longer. Impatience is what wins wars. So I said nothing. I turned, went back into my house, and set the cold mug down on the table. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from the sheer effort of restraint. That night, when the quiet finally returned, I walked out to the fallen tree. The air was crisp, the stars cold and steady above. I knelt beside the stump, brushing my fingers over the raw, pale wood. Margaret's laughter echoed in my memory, her voice urging me not to let anyone trample what we'd built. Frank thought he'd taken my tree. What he didn't know was that he'd planted something else that day. Resolve. I stood there a long time, the silence broken only by the creak of branches in the wind, and I swore, under my breath, that he wouldn't get away with it. Not this time. The next morning I woke early, though sleep had been fitful. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the maple crashing down again, branches snapping, Margaret's bench crushed beneath the weight. The smell of fresh-cut wood still clung to the cold air when I stepped outside, and the stump gleamed pale against the snow like an open wound. Across the yard, Frank was already outside, moving briskly with the satisfaction of a man who believed he'd done something righteous. He had the nerve to wave when he saw me. "Mornin', Robert," he called as if nothing had happened. Looks better already, doesn't it? I didn't answer right away. I just stared at the jagged stump, then at him. Finally, I walked over, boots crunching each step like a drumbeat of restraint. "Frank," I said slowly, keeping my voice level, "you crossed a line. That tree wasn't yours to touch. You had no right." He leaned on his shovel, smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Boundaries are just lines in the snow, Robert. They shift. They blur. You're making too much of this?" "Lines in the snow?" I felt heat rise in my chest, though I held my ground. "Those lines are written in deeds, Frank, in survey maps, in ink, and they've stood longer than you've lived here." He shrugged as if paperwork were beneath him. "I've been talking to a few folks, and nobody cares if the fence is moved a little this way or that. You've got more land than you can use anyway. What's a few feet?" The audacity of it left me momentarily speechless. A few feet, as though land were something you measured by convenience, not by ownership. As though my memories, my wife's hands in the soil, my years of sweat poured into this yard meant nothing. I took a breath, steadying myself. "This isn't about a few feet. It's about respect. You cut down my tree without asking, and now you're talking about moving. Fences, don't push me." Frank's smile widened, smug as ever. "Push you? Robert, you're nearly 70. What are you going to do, sue me? Spend the next 3 years shuffling papers in court while I enjoy my yard?" He turned then, as if the conversation were over, and started hauling the cut branches toward a pile he'd made on his side. He whistled while he worked, a tune sharp enough to grate against my nerves. I stood there a long moment, fists clenched inside my gloves. He thought I was powerless. He thought age made me harmless. When I finally turned back toward my house, Linda was standing on her porch 2 doors down, her scarf pulled tight around her neck. She gave me a knowing look and shook her head slowly, the kind of gesture that said, "I saw everything. I'm with you." That afternoon, I went to the shed and dug out an old metal box Margaret and I had kept locked for years. Inside were the original property documents, yellowed but clear, signed by the county clerk the year we bought this place. Alongside them was the survey map, lines straight and undeniable. I spread them across the table and stared for a long time. These weren't just papers. They were anchors. Proof that what Frank had dismissed as lines in the snow were, in fact, carved in law. The next day, Frank upped the ante. I came outside to find him driving new stakes into the ground, shifting his fence a full 3 feet into my yard. Each hammer blow rang out like a taunt. I didn't confront him this time. Instead, I pulled out my phone and began snapping pictures. Each stake, each board, every arrogant grin he threw my way, I documented it all. When he noticed, he chuckled. "Go ahead, Robert. Take your little photos. Won't change a thing." But he was wrong. Every photo, every note in the ledger I'd begun, was another nail in the coffin of his arrogance. I said nothing. I simply turned and went back inside, closing the door softly behind me. Frank thought he was building a fence. What he didn't realize was that he was building my case. That evening, after Frank had finally gone inside and the hammering stopped, I sat at my kitchen table with the old documents spread before me. The yellow deed, the crisp survey map with its black lines, the signatures that marked the day Margaret and I had first called this place our own. The papers smelled faintly of ink and dust, a scent that carried memory more than time. I traced the lines with my finger, remembering the day we first walked this land together. Margaret had worn a wide-brimmed hat to shield her from the sun, and her laughter carried across the field as she pointed to the maple saplings at the edge. "Let's plant them," she had said, her voice bright with certainty. "They'll grow with us." And they had. Through summers hot enough to wilt the grass, through winters that bent branches under ice, through the long years of raising children and then letting them go, those trees had stood watch. They weren't just trees. They were chapters of a story Margaret and I had written with our own hands. Now one of them lay in pieces, cut down not by nature or time, but by arrogance, by a man who thought boundaries were suggestions, who saw years of care and memory as mere obstacles to his convenience. I got up and walked outside, the night air biting but clear. The stump gleamed pale under the moonlight, its rings exposed like scars. I knelt beside it, running my hand along the fresh cut. Each ring told a year, and I counted them slowly. 41. 41 years of life in that tree. 41 years of shade, of birds nesting, of Margaret sitting on that bench with her garden gloves. Frank had robbed me of more than wood. He had tried to erase memory. But standing there, with the cold seeping into my bones, I felt something stronger than anger. I felt resolve. Margaret's voice came back to me, as clear as the day she spoke it. Don't let people walk over you, Robert. Respect is the one thing you never give away. It's taken. I rose to my feet and looked across at Frank's house. Lights glowed warm in his windows. Laughter drifted faintly from inside. He believed he had won, that I was too old, too tired, too bound by silence to fight back. But I knew better. The next morning I opened my old leather journal, the one Margaret had given me on our 30th anniversary. Its pages were mostly filled with notes about repairs around the house, dates of harvests, even sketches of the garden she loved so much. Now I began a new section. Frank Dillard, I wrote at the top. Underneath, I noted the date he cut down the tree, the time, the tools he used. I described his words. Property lines are just lines in the snow, and taped a photo of the stump beside it. Each entry would be meticulous, each detail exact, because if I was going to fight this battle, I would fight it with patience and precision. Later that week, I drove into town to visit the local library. They kept archives of property disputes, old maps, even newspaper clippings about land cases. The librarian, Mrs. Carter, was a sharp woman with glasses perched at the edge of her nose. "What brings you in today, Robert?" she asked kindly. "History," I replied. "Mine and this neighborhood's." Within an hour, I had copies of maps dating back decades, each one confirming the same boundary. No blurs, no confusion, just clear, unwavering lines. On my way home, I felt lighter, not because the fight was won, but because I knew Margaret would have been proud. I wasn't letting Frank's arrogance define the story of this land. When I pulled into the driveway, Frank was outside again, hammering another board onto his creeping fence. He looked up, smirked, and called out, "That fence is looking good, Robert. You might as well get used to it." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. I simply lifted the folder of documents for him to see before carrying it inside. His smirk faltered just a little. That night, I sat by the fire, journal open on my lap, and wrote a single line beneath the day's entry. He thinks he's taking land. What he doesn't see is that he's already given me the weapon I'll use to take it back. The following week, I started hearing things. Small comments, whispers, the kind of talk that spreads quicker in a small town than frost on a winter morning. It seemed Frank had taken his little victory and carried it straight into the diner, the hardware store, even the barber's chair. "Heard Robert finally gave up that old tree," one man remarked to me at the post office, though the smirk on his face told me whose words he was repeating. "Guess Frank did you a favor, eh?" I didn't answer, only offered a polite nod and walked on. But inside, the words burned. By Friday, Linda knocked on my door with a grocery bag in one hand, and that look in her eyes, the one that said she knew more than she wanted to. She set the bag on the table, pulled off her gloves, and leaned across the counter. "Robert, you need to know," she began. "Frank's been talking about you. Says you're too old to keep up with your land. Says he's just claiming what no one else will use. He's telling people you won't fight back." I clenched my jaw, staring at the steam rising from the kettle. "Did he now?" She nodded. "And worse, he's bragging that once spring comes, he'll put in a row of new trees on your side of the line to clean things up." Her words sat heavy. Frank wasn't just arrogant. He was laying the groundwork to make theft look like charity. That night, I sat with Margaret's old journal open, the fire popping in the hearth, and wrote it all down. Frank told neighbors Robert won't fight. Plans to plant on my land come spring. Arrogance escalating. Each word fueled me. Each line sharpened the quiet blade I was preparing. The next morning, I paid a visit to the county clerk's office again. Sharon, the clerk, looked up from her desk and smiled. "Back so soon, Robert?" "Back," I said evenly. "And this time I'd like certified copies of every map, every survey, and the deed. I'll need them notarized. And I'd like the zoning ordinances for fences and tree removal." She raised a brow. "Trouble?" I didn't smile. "Just preparation." She nodded, printed the documents, and slid them across the counter. "Good idea. Men like Frank, they count on people not knowing the rules. But rules don't bend just because someone talks louder." On the way home, I stopped at the diner for a cup of coffee. As I walked in, heads turned. A couple of men shifted uncomfortably in their seats, no doubt remembering the stories Frank had told. And there he was at the counter, laughing with his chest puffed out, a plate of eggs in front of him. "Robert!" he called, as if we were old friends. "Come on, join us. I was just telling these folks how your land's been a mess for years. Glad I could help clean it up." I met his eyes, steady and calm. "Frank, you've confused arrogance for pride. But don't worry. Sooner or later, people learn the difference." The diner grew quiet. His smile wavered for half a second, then returned, wider, forced. "Old man's just sore," he said, laughing, but the laughter didn't carry far. I paid for my coffee, left a tip, and walked out without another word. That evening I called Mark Peterson, an old friend from my working days, now one of the sharpest real estate lawyers in the county. I told him everything. He listened quietly, then said, "Robert, you've already done the hard part. You've documented, you've got witnesses, you've got official maps. When the time is right, we'll file a complaint and request a survey. Once that's on record, the county will have no choice but to order him off your land." "And the fence?" I asked. He chuckled softly. "The fence will come down, along with his pride." That night, as I walked out to the stump one more time, I placed my hand on the raw wood and whispered, "Not long now, Margaret." He thinks he's winning, but he's building his downfall with every board he hammers. I turned back toward my house, the cold air biting but invigorating. Frank's laughter carried faintly from his porch as he entertained guests, no doubt boasting about his latest conquest. But I smiled to myself, because I knew boasting men never see the storm until it breaks over them. And for Frank Dillard, that storm was already gathering. The first thaw of late winter came with muddy ground and the sound of hammering. I stepped out onto the porch that morning to find Frank knee-deep in my yard again, driving wooden stakes into the soft earth. His fence, the one already leaning into my property, was now crawling farther, inch by inch, like a shadow creeping where it didn't belong. Each slam of his mallet rang out like a challenge. "Frank!" I called, my voice carrying across the yard. "You've gone far enough. That's my land, and you know it." He paused, wiping sweat from his brow, and turned toward me with that familiar smirk. "Relax, Robert. I'm just straightening the line. This is where it should have been all along." "The line hasn't moved in 40 years, I shot back. "You're not straightening, you're stealing." He shrugged, driving another stake into the ground. "Stealing's a strong word. Besides, who's going to stop me? You? Or your stack of old papers?" For a moment, I felt the old fire rise in me. I wanted to march over, rip those stakes out of the ground, and throw them at his feet. But Margaret's voice rang in my head. "Don't let anger write your story." So I did something harder. I went inside, grabbed my camera, and began taking pictures. From every angle. Frank chuckled when he saw me. "Go ahead, old man. Take your little snapshots. Won't change a thing." But he was wrong. Each click of that camera was a nail in his coffin. That evening, Linda stopped by with a basket of muffins. She didn't even wait to be invited in, just set them on the counter and folded her arms. Robert, I saw him out there today. Half the street did. He's making a fool of himself, but he's loud enough that some folks think he's right. I sighed, pouring us both coffee. That's why I'm documenting everything. Every photo, every note. He thinks I'm just an old man with a camera, but he doesn't see the case I'm building. She leaned forward, eyes sharp. When will you make your move? When the time's right, I said. He's not done hanging himself yet. And I was right. By the next week, Frank had erected a full stretch of fence posts, each one planted 3 feet into my yard. He strutted along them like a conqueror surveying his spoils, even inviting a few neighbors over to admire his new boundary. At the diner, I overheard him boasting again. Robert doesn't even know where his land starts. I'm doing him a favor. Man's too old to care anyway. But whispers spread differently this time. Some neighbors frowned, shaking their heads. Others muttered quietly that Frank was pushing too far. The tide was turning. Meanwhile, I met again with Mark Peterson, my lawyer. His office smelled of old books and coffee, and the walls were lined with case files. He studied the photos I laid before him, each one labeled with dates and times. "This is more than enough," he said, tapping the stack. "The county will order a survey, and once that's done, the court will side with you. He'll not only lose the fence, he'll be forced to pay damages for the trees and the encroachment." I leaned back in the chair, letting his words settle. "So we wait?" He nodded. "Let him keep digging the hole. The deeper he goes, the harder the fall." Back at home, I walked the line of his new fence, measuring tape in hand. I wrote each measurement in my journal, adding it to the growing pile of evidence. At the stump of my old maple, I paused, touching the raw wood once more. "Patience," I whispered, as though Margaret were listening. "We'll see this through." That night, Frank had friends over again. Their laughter carried across the dark yard, loud and grating. I could hear him bragging, boasting about his victory, claiming I was too weak to challenge him. I didn't shout back. I didn't rise to it. I just sat at my kitchen table, reviewing my notes, my photos, my deed. Each piece was a puzzle forming a picture he couldn't deny. He thought he was building a fence, but all he was really building was the stage for his downfall. By early March, Frank's fence stood tall and crooked across the line like a scar. Every time I stepped out to fetch the paper, I saw it looming there, boards freshly nailed, daring me to contest it. To him, it wasn't just wood hammered into the ground. It was a statement. I've won. But statements made in arrogance rarely last. That week, I drove back into town with my folder of documents under my arm. Mark Peterson greeted me in his office with his usual brisk handshake. "Robert, you ready?" I laid the folder on his desk. Inside were the photographs, the maps, the notarized deed, and even witness statements Linda had helped collect from neighbors who'd watched Frank move the fence. Mark flipped through them, his smile widening. "This is airtight. I'll draft the formal complaint today. Once we file, the county will send a surveyor. That survey will be the nail in his coffin." For the first time in weeks, I felt something like relief. Not victory yet. Victory would come later. But the comfort of knowing the wheels of justice were beginning to turn. When I got home, the comfort didn't last long. Frank was in his yard, stringing up lights across his new fence. He had a cooler of beer at his feet, music blasting from a speaker. By evening, cars lined the street. He was hosting a party, the kind he loved, loud and brazen, meant for show. From my porch, I watched neighbors arrive, some reluctantly, others eager to be on the side of noise. I could hear Frank's booming laugh above the music, his voice carrying across the night, like a man staking his claim on more than land, on pride itself. At one point, I caught his words clear as day. "Robert's finished. Look at this fence. It's mine now. He'll be gone before summer." The people around him laughed, raising their bottles in agreement. I stood in the shadows of my porch, not moving, not speaking, just listening. Linda joined me for a moment, wrapped in her scarf. "Don't let him get to you," she said softly. "He's loud because he's afraid. Men who know they're right don't need to shout." I nodded. though the sting still pressed against my chest. Inside, I pulled out my journal and wrote, March 14th. Frank hosted party, claiming land as his. Witnesses heard him boast fence was permanent. The more he bragged, the more ammunition he gave me. By midnight, the music died down, the cars rolled away, and the street returned to silence. I sat by the window, watching the lights flicker off at Frank's house, and thought of Margaret again. She had always said that arrogance burns itself out. I just had to endure long enough to watch it happen. 2 days later, Mark called. It's filed. The county will schedule a survey within the month. Don't confront him. Let the law do the talking. I thanked him and hung up, staring out at the crooked fence. Frank was out there again, hammering another board, humming tunelessly like a man satisfied with his own reflection. But what he didn't know was that his reflection was about to crack, because the survey was coming, and when it did, those boards would fall faster than his arrogance could prop them up. The morning the county surveyor showed up, the air was cool and damp, with fog hanging low over the fields. I'd been waiting for this day since the moment Frank first cut down my maple. This wasn't just another visit from a neighbor or a chat at the diner. This was official, the kind of action that spoke louder than any boast. At 9 sharp, a white county truck rolled up, a magnetic seal on the door reading Planning and Zoning Department. A man in a heavy canvas jacket stepped out, clipboard in one hand, steel-tipped boots crunching against the gravel. "Mr. Turner?" he asked, extending a hand. "Name's Alan Price. I'm here to mark the line." I shook his hand firmly. "I appreciate you coming." He gave me a small nod. "We've got your deed, your maps, and your complaint. Today's about confirming what's already on paper." By then, Frank had noticed. He came striding across his yard, still in his work boots, his jaw already tight. "What's going on here?" he barked. Alan glanced at him calmly. "We're conducting a property survey, sir. Standard procedure in response to a complaint." Frank snorted. "Complaint? From him?" He jabbed a thumb in my direction. "Figures. The old man's been crying about that fence for months. Waste of taxpayer money, if you ask me." Alan didn't flinch. "It's not up for debate. We'll take our measurements, and the records will speak for themselves." With that, he and his assistant began unloading their equipment. Tripods, rods, markers, and a GPS unit that looked like it belonged in a science lab. They moved with precision, setting stakes at intervals, their eyes on the maps and their hands steady. I stood at the edge of my porch, watching. Each thunk of a survey stake into the ground was like a drumbeat in my chest. Frank, on the other hand, paced like a caged animal, muttering curses under his breath. After an hour, Alan called me over. He pointed to a bright orange flag planted firmly in the soil. "Here's your boundary, Mr. Turner. And as you can see," he gestured toward Frank's new fence. "This line is 3.5 feet inside your property. Clear encroachment." The words hit like a hammer. I'd known it, of course. I'd measured myself, checked the maps, seen the truth with my own eyes. But hearing it from the county surveyor made it real. Undeniable. Frank stormed over, face red. "That can't be right. Your equipment's faulty. I had a buddy tell me—" Alan cut him off. "Your buddy doesn't write the law. The deed and our records do, and they're clear. This fence is illegal." For a long moment, silence stretched between us. Frank's eyes darted from the flag to the fence, then to me. His smirk was gone, replaced by something raw. Panic. I kept my voice calm. "I told you, Frank. The line hasn't moved in 40 years. You just didn't want to believe it." Alan handed me a copy of the preliminary report. "Final documents will be mailed within 2 weeks. Once filed, the county will issue an order to remove the fence. If he refuses, enforcement will handle it." I nodded. "Thank you." As the truck pulled away, Frank stood rigid in his yard, fists clenched at his sides. "You think this is over?" he spat. "You'll regret this, Robert. You and that nosy woman next door." I didn't rise to the bait. I simply turned, walked back into my house, and set the report on the table. Margaret's journal lay open beside it, and I wrote a single line beneath the date. The county marked the truth today. Frank's fence stands on borrowed time. That evening, Linda came over with a pot of stew. She set it down and grinned when I showed her the orange survey, flags still visible in the yard. "Well," she said, ladling soup into bowls, "looks like his castle just lost its moat." I smiled faintly. Now it's only a matter of time. And as I ate, the weight of months began to ease, because patience had done what shouting never could. It had brought the law to my side, quietly and firmly. For a few days after the surveyor left those bright orange flags in the ground, Frank disappeared. His truck sat idle in the driveway, no hammering, no music blaring from the yard. At first, I thought maybe, just maybe, he had accepted the inevitable. But men like Frank don't surrender quietly. They retreat only long enough to gather their next burst of arrogance. It began with a knock at my door one morning. When I opened it, a man in a cheap suit stood on my porch, briefcase in hand. He introduced himself as Mr. Callahan, an attorney supposedly representing Frank. "Mr. Turner," he said with a strained smile, "my client believes there's been a misunderstanding regarding the property boundary. He's willing to negotiate if you'd like to avoid further legal costs." I almost laughed. Negotiation? The county's survey already confirmed the line. There's nothing to negotiate. His smile faltered. "Well, my client intends to challenge those results in court?" I leaned against the doorframe, meeting his eyes steadily. "Tell your client I'm not the one he should worry about. The county issued the order. If he wants to fight, he'll be fighting the law, not me." The lawyer shifted uncomfortably, mumbled something about further steps, and left. Later that week, I saw Frank back in his yard, storming around with a phone pressed to his ear, his voice carried clear across the fence. "I don't care what the survey says. Those lines are wrong. They have to be. This is my land." His wife, Martha, hovered nearby, her arms crossed, her face drawn tight with embarrassment. I caught her eye once, and for the first time, I saw no support there, only exhaustion. The following Saturday, Frank staged his counterattack. He invited half a dozen neighbors to his yard, handing out beers like bribes, and began ranting loudly about corrupt surveyors and lazy county officials. He waved his arms, pointing at the fence as though sheer volume could rewrite the truth. "Look at this fence," he shouted, straight as an arrow. "You think Robert's old maps mean anything. He just doesn't want me improving the neighborhood." A few people nodded politely, more out of discomfort than agreement. Others avoided his eyes, clearly weary of his bluster. I stayed on my porch, saying nothing, sipping coffee while Linda sat beside me. She whispered, "He's not convincing anyone. The louder he yells, the smaller he looks." She was right. The more Frank fought, the more desperate he appeared. The next week, the county mailed the official order. The fence must be removed within 30 days, or the county would remove it at Frank's expense. I found mine in the mailbox at noon. By supper, Frank had already torn his copy into shreds and scattered it angrily across his driveway. That night, his shouting carried through the thin winter air. I could hear him arguing with Martha, his words sharp and ugly. "You think Robert's better than me? You think I'm going to let him win?" Her reply was too quiet to make out, but the slam of their door afterward said enough. I wrote in my journal, March 28th, Frank rejects county order. Anger spreading into his own home. Fence still stands, but not for long. As April crept in, the fence looked less like a victory and more like a countdown clock. The orange flags still stood like sentinels, defiant against his boards, and each day the county's deadline drew closer. Frank, meanwhile, looked worn, his bravado cracked in places, the bags under his eyes deeper, his shouts less convincing. He was fighting shadows, trying to overturn the inevitable, and everyone could see it. One evening, Linda and I walked past his house on our way to the market. Frank stood at his porch, glaring as we passed. "You'll regret this, Robert." he muttered loud enough for me to hear. "Mark my words, you'll regret it." I stopped, met his eyes, and said quietly, "The only one with regrets here is you, Frank. Every board you nailed, every word you bragged, those are the things you'll wish you could take back." His face flushed, but he said nothing more. By the time we reached the corner, Linda squeezed my arm. "You didn't shout. You didn't argue. That's why you're winning. He's beating himself." And she was right. The truth was already carved into the ground with survey stakes. The law was already written on paper with official stamps. Frank could fight, scream, and hire cheap lawyers all he wanted. But the end was already decided. His fence was living on borrowed time. The 30 days passed faster than Frank must have expected. To me, each morning felt steady, patient, like watching the slow drip of water carve stone. But for Frank, I imagine it was a clock ticking louder with every swing of his hammer, every glare he cast across the street. By mid-April, the deadline had arrived. The county trucks rolled in early, their diesel engines breaking the morning quiet. I stood on my porch with my coffee, watching as 2 white pickups and a flatbed trailer pulled up in front of Frank's house. On their doors, the same seal from the Planning and Zoning Department gleamed under the sunlight. Alan Price, the surveyor who had driven those orange flags into the ground weeks ago, stepped out first. He looked calm, clipboard tucked under his arm, hard hat strapped on tight. Behind him were 3 workers in heavy gloves, carrying tools, crowbars, mallets, and a portable saw. Frank burst out of his house, red-faced, boots unlaced, shouting before his feet even hit the driveway. "You can't do this. This is my fence, my land." Alan didn't raise his voice. He simply unfolded the county order, stamped, and signed. "Mr. Dillard, you were given 30 days to comply. You have not removed the fence. By law, we are authorized to remove it at your expense. Any interference will result in additional fines." Frank grabbed the paper, crumpled it in his fist, and threw it into the mud. "This is harassment. Robert's behind all of this. He's poisoned you people against me." Alan adjusted his glasses, unbothered. "The land doesn't lie, Mr. Dillard. Our survey speaks for itself." Neighbors began to gather. First Mrs. Wilson from the corner house, then Derek and his wife, then a few others. They stood on their porches, drawn by the noise and the flashing hazard lights. Whispers carried across the street. "What's going on? Looks like the county's finally tearing down Frank's fence. About time." I stayed quiet, sipping my coffee, my eyes on the scene, but my expression unreadable. The crew wasted no time. They began at the far end, prying loose the first warped board with a crowbar. Wood cracked, nails screeched as they were forced free. The sound was sharp, final. Frank charged forward, arms flailing. "Stop! Stop, damn it! You can't touch that!" The sheriff's deputy, who had arrived quietly in a separate car, stepped forward and held up a hand. "Mr. Dillard, you interfere. You'll be cited. Stand back." Frank froze, breathing hard, fists clenched. His face was crimson, but he stepped back, muttering curses under his breath. Board by board, the fence came apart. Each crack of wood was a drumbeat, each thunk of falling posts a note in a song of justice. Linda joined me on my porch, her scarf wrapped tight against the breeze. "You waited," she whispered, "and now look." I nodded, watching as the workers hauled sections onto the flatbed, leaving behind the open ground where Frank had tried to claim victory. By noon, half the fence was down. By 2, nothing remained but a pile of broken boards strapped to the trailer. The orange survey flag still fluttered in the wind, standing proud and undeniable. Frank stood at the edge of his yard, shoulders slumped, eyes wild with a mix of fury and humiliation. He looked smaller somehow, stripped of the swagger that once made him seem larger than life. When the crew finished, Alan walked over and handed him an invoice. "Removal fees, payable within 30 days. Frank ripped the paper in half, but the gesture felt hollow. Everyone watching knew the law didn't bend to temper tantrums. The workers packed their tools, the trucks pulled away, and slowly the neighbors drifted back into their homes, But the whispers remained, carried like wind through the street. That's what happens when arrogance meets the law. He brought it on himself. Robert never had to raise his voice. I stepped back inside, setting my empty coffee mug on the counter. For the first time in months, the view from my kitchen window was clear again. No crooked boards leaning into my yard, no mockery nailed into the soil. Just open space, quiet and clean. That night, I wrote in my journal, April 15th. The fence is gone. Justice doesn't shout, it just waits its turn. And for the first time in a long while, I slept deeply, without dreams of chainsaws or hammering. The morning after the county crew hauled away Frank's fence, the street felt different. It wasn't just the open view across my yard where the boards had once loomed. It was the air itself, lighter somehow, easier to breathe. Neighbors walked their dogs a little slower, kids rode their bikes down the block with less tension, as if everyone had been waiting for this unspoken shift. Frank, however, was a storm without thunder. I saw him that afternoon, pacing his driveway like a man stranded on an island. His arms flailed as he spoke on the phone, his voice carrying across the street. They can't do this to me. I've lived here 15 years. I built that fence with my own hands. Robert doesn't deserve that land. He tricked them. He tricked everyone. But no one came to listen. His driveway, once the center of noisy weekend barbecues, now sat empty. The men who used to laugh at his stories avoided eye contact at the hardware store. The whispers I overheard at the diner had changed too. Frank really thought he could get away with it. Robert handled it better than I would have. Funny how quiet his house is now. It was as if the neighborhood had taken sides without ever saying so aloud, and the side wasn't his. Inside Frank's own home, things weren't better. Martha, his wife, had always been polite, though reserved. Now she barely left the house, and when she did, her expression carried the tightness of someone enduring more than she let on. One evening I heard them shouting, his voice booming, hers sharp and weary. "You've embarrassed us." "Frank," she cried, her words clear through the open windows. "You've embarrassed me. Everyone's laughing and you don't even see it. They're laughing at Robert, not me," he bellowed back. "He's the one who made a spectacle of this." "No," Martha said, her voice breaking. "You did. You always do." The slam of a door followed, and the silence that came after seemed heavier than the shouting. A few days later, Emily, their daughter, came home from college for the weekend. I saw her unloading a suitcase from her car, her expression tense. That evening, while I was watering my garden, I overheard her speaking sharply to Frank on the porch. "Dad, you're obsessed. It's just land. You've turned this into some kind of crusade, and now Mom can't even show her face in town." Frank's voice was brittle. "I'm protecting what's mine." Emily's reply was softer, but it carried more weight than all his shouting. "It was never yours." I didn't linger to hear more. That was their battle, not mine. But it was clear, even under his own roof, his fortress of pride was crumbling. Meanwhile, life for me felt steadier than it had in months. The view from my kitchen window stretched clean across to the field beyond, unbroken by Frank's crooked boards. Birds had returned to the maple stump, perching on the raw wood, as if reclaiming it for themselves. Linda joined me one evening as the sun dipped low, painting the sky orange. We sat on my porch swing, her scarf tucked tight, sipping warm cider. She glanced toward Frank's darkened house and said quietly, "Funny, isn't it? He built that fence to make himself look bigger. Now that it's gone, he looks smaller than ever." I nodded slowly. That's the thing about arrogance. It builds high walls. But when they fall, all that's left is the man hiding behind them. She smiled faintly, squeezing my hand. "And you never raised your voice. That's what everyone respects, Robert. You let patience do the work." That night, as I wrote in my journal, I realized something important. Revenge wasn't about shouting a man down or trading insult for insult. It was about letting him unravel under the weight of his own pride, until there was nothing left for him to hide behind, and Frank Dillard was unraveling faster than he knew. It was a gray April morning when the letter came. The envelope bore the county seal, and the weight of it felt heavier than paper had any right to be. I sat at my kitchen table, glasses perched low on my nose, and carefully slid it open. Inside were 3 pages, the official survey results, the county's decision, and the fine breakdown. I read each line slowly, letting the words sink in like steady drops of rain. The fence constructed by Mr. Frank Dillard has been found in violation of county code. Encroachment confirmed at 3.5 feet. Removal completed by county enforcement. Cost charged to property owner. But it didn't stop there. In addition, damages are awarded to Mr. Robert Turner for the unlawful removal of trees located within his deeded property line. Compensation in the amount of $8,200 is to be paid by Mr. Dillard within 60 days. I leaned back in my chair, the paper trembling slightly in my hands. $8,200. It wasn't about the money. I could have lived without a dime. It was the acknowledgement. The county had seen what those trees meant, and they had put it in writing. Justice on paper. I folded the letter neatly, slipped it back into the envelope, and set it on the table. For a long moment, I just sat there, staring out the window at the empty stretch where Frank's fence had once stood. It looked like freedom now, wide and unobstructed. Later that afternoon, I saw Frank storming up his driveway, the same envelope clutched in his fist. His face was red, his steps quick and uneven. He didn't look toward my porch, though I knew he felt my eyes on him. He slammed his door so hard the glass rattled in its frame. Linda arrived not long after, carrying a pie dish covered in foil. "Heard the mailman had something for both of you today," she said knowingly. I chuckled. "That's one way to put it." I handed her the letter, letting her read the county's ruling. She covered her mouth, stifling a laugh. "Oh, Robert," she said, eyes twinkling. "They didn't just take his fence. They made him pay for your trees, too. That's salt in the wound." I smiled faintly. "He'll call it robbery. But we know better." That evening, as the sun dipped low, I heard shouting next door. Frank's voice, ragged and desperate, carried across the quiet street. "I'm not paying it, Martha. Not a dime. They can't make me." Her reply was sharp, cutting through the walls. "They can, Frank, and they will. You brought this on yourself. You and your damn pride." The silence that followed was louder than the shouting. At the diner the next day, the whispers had changed again. "Did you hear? The county fined Frank. Robert's getting compensation for those trees. About time. Guess Frank's not as untouchable as he thought." I didn't gloat. I just stirred my coffee, offered polite nods, and went on with my day. But inside there was a quiet satisfaction. Not triumph. That was too loud a word. No, this was something steadier. A sense that the scales had finally balanced. When I returned home, I walked out to the old maple stump. I knelt beside it, pressing my palm to the rings that told its story. "Margaret," I whispered. They finally saw. They understood. The wind rustled through the yard, cool and steady, as if carrying her voice back to me. That night, I wrote in my journal, April 27th, county awarded damages for the trees. The fight is finished. What was taken has been acknowledged. Respect restored. For the first time since this began, I felt the fight was no longer mine to carry. It was over. By May, spring had settled in. Tulips bloomed along the sidewalks. Kids played catch in front yards, and the air was sweet with the scent of lilacs. But across from my house, Frank's place felt like the only spot where spring hadn't arrived. His lawn grew patchy, his shutters still needed paint, and his porch, once a stage for loud boasts, sat quiet and hollow. Quiet, that is, until one Saturday afternoon. I was weeding the garden when the sound of a megaphone cracked the peace. At first, I thought it might be the town parade practicing down the street, but when I looked up, I saw Frank in his driveway, standing on a wooden crate, a plastic bullhorn pressed to his lips. "Neighbors!" he bellowed, his voice distorted through the cheap speaker. "You've been lied to. Robert tricked the county. That fence was mine, that land was mine, and now they're bleeding me dry with false fines." Heads turned up and down the street, curtains twitched, doors opened. Within minutes, a small crowd had gathered, not out of support, but curiosity. Frank continued, his face red with effort. "I built that fence to protect us, to keep this neighborhood safe, and they tore it down. And now they say I owe him money for some worthless trees that were diseased, dying." I set down my gloves and straightened slowly. Linda had come to the edge of her yard, arms folded, her expression unreadable. One of the neighbors, Derek, called out from his porch, "Frank, enough. We all saw the survey. We know whose land it is." Frank swung the bullhorn toward him. "You don't understand. Robert's manipulating you. He's been plotting this for years. His words faltered, stammering as if even he didn't believe them anymore. Mrs. Wilson, the widow from the corner, stepped forward with her cane. "Frank, stop embarrassing yourself. That land was never yours. You've bullied us all long enough. We're tired of it." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Heads nodded. A few people clapped quietly. Frank's face contorted, a mix of rage and desperation. He raised the bullhorn again, but the words tumbled out, weak, broken. You'll regret siding with him. All of you. But the strength was gone. Finally, Martha emerged from their doorway, her face pale, her voice sharp. "Frank, enough!" She strode down the porch steps, yanked the bullhorn from his hands, and tossed it into the grass. "You've humiliated yourself, this family, and this neighborhood. No more." The silence that followed was deafening. The neighbors began drifting back to their porches, shaking their heads, muttering under their breath. The show was over, and no one had been impressed. Frank stood there, frozen, his chest heaving, his pride crumbling before the very people he had once tried to command. Martha turned on her heel and went back inside, the screen door slamming behind her. I met Linda's eyes across the way. She shook her head slowly, then gave me a faint smile. "Well," she said softly, "there's the end of him." I walked back to the garden, knelt in the soil, and pulled another weed from the earth. My heart was steady, calm. Revenge hadn't come in a single dramatic strike. It had come like the turning of seasons, slow, patient, inevitable. That night, as I sat by the fire, I wrote in my journal, May 10th. Frank made his last outburst. The neighborhood turned away, pride finally silenced. For the first time since Margaret's tree had fallen, I felt something close to peace settle over me. The days that followed Frank's outburst felt different, like a weight had finally been lifted from our street. For months his arrogance had hung over us all, like storm clouds, darkening every neighborly exchange, every quiet evening. Now, after his humiliation, the air seemed clearer. The block belonged to itself again, not to the noise of one man. One morning I stood in the yard with a spade in my hands, the sun warming the soil beneath me. The stump of Margaret's maple sat there still, raw and pale, but no longer a wound. It was a reminder. And reminders can either chain you to grief or guide you toward renewal. I had chosen renewal. At the nursery in town, I had picked out 3 young saplings, red maples just like the ones Margaret and I had planted when we first bought this land. The clerk had asked if I needed help loading them into my truck, and I'd smiled, shaking my head. I planted the first ones with my wife 40 years ago. I think I can manage these. So here I was, shovel biting into the earth, the smell of fresh soil rising into the spring air. Linda watched from her porch, a mug of tea in her hands, her face warm with encouragement. "It's about time, Robert," she called softly. "Margaret would have liked this." I nodded, my throat tightening, and placed the first sapling into the ground. Its roots spread eagerly into the hole, drinking in the soil as if it knew this was where it belonged. I patted the dirt around its base, steady and firm. By the time the second and third saplings were planted, my back ached, but my heart felt lighter than it had in months. As the sun dipped low, I sat on the porch steps, gazing out at the 3 young trees swaying gently in the breeze. They weren't tall yet, not like their predecessors, but they carried something more important: hope. That evening, Derek came by with his son, a gangly teenager who'd once played under the shade of the old maple. "Looks good, Robert," Derek said, clapping me on the shoulder. "You're putting the yard back the way it should be." His boy grinned. "When those grow big, I'll bring my kids here to play under them." The words struck deep, warming me. Margaret had always said trees were gifts you planted not for yourself, but for the future. Later, Linda joined me on the porch, carrying a plate of warm bread. She set it between us, breaking off a piece. "You know," she said, her voice thoughtful, "the whole neighborhood saw what happened, but what they'll remember isn't the fight, it's this." She nodded toward the saplings. "This is what lasts." I watched the trees swaying gently, their leaves catching the fading light, and realized she was right. The fight with Frank, the fence, the shouting, that would fade in memory. But these roots, these leaves, would endure. Across the street, Frank's house sat dark, his lawn neglected, his shutters sagging. He had grown quieter since the bullhorn incident. No more shouting, no more late-night hammering. Only silence. A man who had once demanded attention now sat invisible, ignored. And that, in its own way, was the deepest revenge of all. Not that I had destroyed him, but that he had destroyed himself while I rebuilt. That night, I wrote in my journal, May 20th, planted 3 new maples. Margaret's legacy renewed. The land is whole again. For the first time since this battle began, I felt at peace, not just with the fight, but with the future. Summer settled over Maplewood like a warm blanket, the kind of season Margaret used to love. The air smelled of lilacs, kids played barefoot in the street, and evenings hummed with cicadas. For the first time in years, I sat on my porch swing with nothing heavy on my shoulders. The fight was over. Frank's house across the way had changed too, not in paint or structure, but in spirit. The laughter, the shouting, the endless posturing were gone. His driveway stayed empty most days, his porch unused. Sometimes I saw him sitting in the dim glow of his living room, staring out the window at the 3 saplings in my yard. But he never waved, never spoke. His pride had withered with the fence boards the county hauled away. And me? I had chosen something different. Each morning I walked the yard, checking the new maples. Their leaves caught the sun just right, flashing green fire in the breeze. They weren't tall yet, but they were growing fast, roots deepening in the soil that was rightfully theirs, rightfully mine. Every time I touched the bark, I felt Margaret close, as if she were smiling at how the land was healing, how I was healing. Neighbors stopped by often now. Derek brought his son to toss a ball under the young trees. Mrs. Wilson came with her cobbler, setting it down on my counter with a satisfied smile. And Linda, faithful, kind Linda, sat with me on the porch, her laughter filling the quiet evenings that used to echo with Frank's arrogance. One evening, as the sky turned orange and the maples swayed, she said softly, "You didn't just win back your land, Robert. You won back your dignity. And you showed the rest of us that patience doesn't mean weakness." Her words stayed with me, because the truth was this had never been just about land or fences or even trees. It was about respect, a man's right to what he's built, a man's right not to be silenced, no matter his age. Frank tried to take that from me, but in the end it was his own pride that undid him. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to slam doors or wave bullhorns. All I needed was time, patience, and faith that the truth would hold. And it did. Now, as I sit here writing these words, I realize the sweetest revenge isn't loud. It's quiet. It's watching the arrogant crumble under their own weight while you stand tall, unbroken. It's sitting on your porch on a summer night with the breeze in your trees and peace in your heart. I had anchored it all where it mattered, in the soil, in memory. indignity, and that was more than enough. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe to our channel, and tell us in the comments which city you're watching from. Your support keeps these stories alive.